Hey Ellie, so we're gonna do a kind of very simple mountain snow scene. I think the thing I like to focus on is picking a light source. We're gonna put it up here. And creating some soft mottled colors that look like reflections on the snow before we do our shadows. So I've kind of drawn some edges, some shapes here that I can kind of pretend to pick light on one side or the other of. Since you're working with night scenes also, you'll have a nice amount of contrast with the sky, which is great. And then they might actually be bluer or softer or, any number of versions of this. You can choose how effective your lighting source is. Mine's going to be really bright. So I like to use a purple as a shadow on whites, purples, blues. Since it's also a mountain, you could use some browns. You could use greens. I'll use some greens. Try to swatch as I'm going up here on the top corner. And I do a little bit of wet blending. So since I laid down that first layer, when I'm going over it with this one, they're going to automatically blend. They're also going to, since there's lots of water on the page, dry lighter, which is useful to know. If you have another mountain in the distance, remember that as they go into the distance, they get less punchy, less high contrast, and usually softer, and often cooler in color tone. So I'll add a little bit of gray. I'm muddying my gray with a bit of my purple so it's softer. And you can have kind of, if you just leave it brush strokey like this, you'll have a very jagged mountain. If you make it softer, kind of mottled tones, it's a softer, like snowier mountain. If it gets too punchy, just put water on your brush and then clean it, and then use that little spot you put down to kind of spread it out. So I'm using clean brushes with lots of water in them. I'm not wiping them off very much, and then picking up small amount of pigment. I'm also using a larger brush, which makes this easier. So we're starting to move into shadows now. I'm trying to swatch on the side there so you can kind of see, but everything is still wet, so it's going to dilute out. I'm using a hesitant kind of dabbing motion as well as keeping any brush strokes I am doing kind of in the same general rhythm of like going up and down the mountain, sculpting around forms. If you want bigger blobs, use the side of your brush. If you want tinier ones, use the tiny tip. But since this is all wet, it's going to nicely blend together. Now I've left the side that I stated was my light source as pretty much pure white, but using that mountain behind it to show where it is in the structure of it. You can also blot if you think it's gotten a little bit too saturated, and you can use blotting or salt or even sand. I said salt really weird there, sorry. In order to create more texture in it, let it dry entirely with that. You can't do it as well with a blow dryer, and it would create a nice amount of texture. Here I'm using a deep blue mixed with a bit of black in order to do our final shadows, our final high contrast. So remember, if you're working in like a night scene, you'd have maybe less contrast and more shadows overall. Maybe just the outside edge of the mountain would be more highlighted, or just one face, but they wouldn't be as much pure white. You'd have more of the modeling overall, less white in general, and more shadows. Fully admit I sort of forgot you were doing a night scene until the very end of this when I paint the sky dark, because I remembered. As the shadows get down the mountain, they tend to get wider and less stark. You're getting more bounce light. They're more angular at the top and broken up, because that's where it gets rockier as opposed to like snowy and rounded. We were right about to when I recalled that you were doing a night scene, and I decided to paint the sky black. Which also helps show where the light is. Having the sky painted a color, even if it's not black, would help define where that top edge is and send it into a higher contrast, which shows the lighting. I use a black gouache for this, but you could use watercolor or India ink or any of the above. If something looks choppy, you can wet your brush, put a little bit more of the color on it, and sort of get it to be into a standing wash. That will help keep it from developing too much texture. Now, one of your images had some trees in the foreground. I'm mixing black with a bit of green and doing this sort of like draw the trunk of the tree first and then flush it out with this sort of, it starts with the branches leaning up more vertically from that point, and then they sort of fall down and away from it and become more horizontal as they get to the bottom. I would do them in sort of banks of trees, letting them be wet and overlap, and then let that dry and do the trees in front of it. So you're like stacking them like fences as you move towards you. And they would get more defined as they move towards you. And bigger. So see, this tree I just did actually carries off the page on the bottom and reaches higher than the tree behind it in the front. That helps with the perspective. I'll put this one in like it's behind that one, but it doesn't really matter them painting them out of order because they're all going to blend together. So there you go. Little mountain scene. Hope that helps.